So far we ran only a single container. Running a single container is super easy. You can even do it manually. But the challenge comes when you try to run hundreds or even thousands of containers. You need to think about container scheduling. You need to think about finding a hardware resource that has the resource demands that the container wants. For example, you may have a finance application that wants to have 500 megabyte of memory before starting the container. So you need to find a hardware resource that has 500 megabyte of free memory before running that container. So this is where the real challenge comes in. And that's why we have invented Amazon ECR, or Amazon Elastic Container Registry, and Amazon ECS, which is Amazon Elastic Container Service. Amazon Elastic Container Registry is a container repository that you can use to keep your container images in a centralized location. It's similar to Docker Hub. The only difference is that it's tightly integrated with AWS Identity and Access Management, so that you can say things like, hey, these are production servers and they should have access to only production repository. Amazon ECS is an orchestration engine. There are a lot of container orchestration engines like Kubernetes, for example, and Amazon ECS is yet another container orchestration engine that has some built-in intelligence and tight integration with AWS services so that you can easily run containers at scale. How ECS works is it has a concept called a cluster. A cluster abstracts a set of compute, memory, and storage. So behind the scene, inside a cluster, you have these EC2 instances that are running. So the memory, CPU, and the storage is provided by these EC2 instances running inside the cluster. You can have a cluster where you add the instances. You can scale this cluster horizontally. You can scale out and scale in if you want. So once you have this cluster of resources, you create something called a task. So tasks define things like what set of containers that you want to run. You may say, hey, I want to run this ASP.NET Web application, and along with that, I want to run this SQL Server. And also you define the constraints. So for example, you can define a constraints like, this is a super critical finance application and it should not run on the same host where the HR application is running. You can also define things like the resource demand. This container needs at least 500 megabyte of memory and 2 CPUs. So once you define a task, the next thing is to define something called a service. A service defines things like how many tasks to run. So for example, if you have a web application, you may need to have at least 2 tasks running into availability zone, and a load balancer may need to do round robin load balancing across those 2 tasks. So the service defines how many tasks that you want to run. You can also define a deployment strategy. For example, do you want to do a blue-green deployment? Do you want to do a balanced spread deployment? Also, the service defines things like the auto-scaling strategy. For example, you can tell, hey, when the CPU reaches to a certain level, you need to start multiple tasks. The beauty of the service is that it can maintain some desired set of tasks. For example, you can say, I need to run at least 6 tasks to maintain the service level for this service. And for some reason, if this task is running in this, 3 tasks are running in this instance and another 3 tasks are running in this instance. And if this instance fails, the service will make sure that another 3 additional tasks will get scheduled in some other instances. So once you have this service, the ECS has some built-in intelligence to place your containers. For example, you can place the containers in a bin packing fashion, where the ECS fill one container host before going into the other container host. You can also have a container placement like, for example, balance spread, where the ECS place containers evenly across, let's say, 2 EC2 instances in 2 availability zones. So if this instance goes down, you still have, if this instance goes down, you still have some set of containers running in the other instance in the other availability zones. You can also define custom placement algorithms if you want. So once you have these services, you will have like multiple services, like one service for HR application, one service for finance application, one for marketing application. You place them on the cluster, and ECS will orchestrate these containers or the task or the services, and your application will function. So in the subsequent labs, we are going to explore how to publish your images into ECR and then run your containers on ECS. So let's get started.